So yes, my name is Nicky Falkof. I live in Johannesburg and I cycle in Johannesburg. And I cycle to get around. I cycle as a mode of transport rather than as a mode of exercise.
So you commute to work. Are you mad? I mean, Johannesburg is, just in terms of driving a car, is a fairly challenging place.
I'm not mad. I'm lucky because I live close enough to where I work that I can cycle to work fairly quickly, but also using back streets and routes that I've figured out that feel relatively safe. I also, after moving back here, I'm from here originally, after moving back here, I made friends with a little gang of people who are also commuter cyclists who reassured me quite quickly that it wasn't nearly as frightening as I thought it was, and it wasn't as impossible as I thought it was. And so I made the decision to try it, and it's been fantastic.
You were saying earlier there's 3 different types of cyclists in the city. Describe those to me.
Okay, so number 1, you have working class black people who very often work around the suburbs or work in townships or live in townships and work close by. So you'll see these people traversing back streets quite slowly, relatively gently, usually without safety gear, without security gear, with older, less fancy bikes. And these are people that I've seen around Joburg since I was a kid growing up. And then you get people like me, there aren't that many of us, commuter cyclists who are generally quite middle class. A growing number of students doing it. We're encouraging the students at my university to take it up.
Both black and white?
Both black and white. Quite nice bikes, generally bike geeks, but not obsessive bike geeks. And then you get class 3, which is the Lycra people. And if you ever happen to be awake in the suburbs of Johannesburg at about 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning and you leave your house, you will see hordes and hordes and hordes of Lycra people leaving the suburbs in droves to go and do big sports cycles around the outskirts of Johannesburg or through the interior of Johannesburg, where they can traverse some of the biggest hills in the city. And these are people who never use their bicycles for transport, who wouldn't consider using their bicycles for transport, who don't own bike locks or bike lights because they never lock their bikes up or use them at night, and who generally have head-to-toe Lycra and extremely expensive gear and take cycling extremely seriously as a sport.
And they take part in, there's lots of cycling events here, aren't there?
Constant cycling events, some really large races, and people tend to do these things en masse in really large groups.
What kind of infrastructure is there in terms of cycle lanes and things like that in the city?
At the moment, none. There is a small network of cycle lanes that's slowly being developed. Some have been built in Orlando and Soweto already, and some have been built in Braamfontein outside the university where we are right now. They don't link up with each other as yet. They haven't really been properly signposted as yet, so at the moment cars are still parking in them or taxis are ignoring them. And they don't go as far as they do. There's one outside this university that stops in the middle of a really busy road, so that's quite frightening. But the City Council has committed to building a coherent infrastructure of bike lanes that goes at least around the central part of the city where lots of students live and out to Soweto. So we're all hoping very strongly that that happens. There's also some development going on in Sandton, in the Sandton area, where the large corporate facilities are, the large banks, where people are trying to set up a rent-a-bike system in the vein of larger cities around the world, which could potentially help to relieve the really bad congestion in Sandton. Although obviously if that happens, there also needs to be a significant cultural shift where people stop thinking that bicycles are a lower class form of transport.
And this is all part of the mayor's view of Johannesburg as a global city? It's
part of a consistent and ongoing attempt to modernise this city and to retain its position as, I think, a powerhouse on the continent and in the global south, but also to make that more and more modern. There's a lot of talk that goes on about how Johannesburg should be equated with Beijing rather than Detroit or Houston. So there is a conceptual move to put us more in line with other cities in the global south, but in reality we have a very, very powerful car culture, and it's extremely related to status, it's extremely related to wealth, and the shifts that will need to happen to change that are about more than the city building bike lanes.
And you were talking earlier about there being a pressure group that had put pressure on to get these cycleways. Who are those?
They're less a pressure group than a fun group, but they're called JUCA, J-U-C-A, the Johannesburg Urban Cyclists Association. And it's comprised of a bunch of people, some of whom are friends of mine, generally quite young, racial mix, different backgrounds, fairly middle class, different types of jobs, different areas of the city in which they live and work, who all are commuter cyclists and believe passionately in the value and importance of commuter cycling, and have been putting pressure and trying to open discussions with the city for a fairly long time, and I think have been really instrumental in the fact that bike lanes are now being built, and have actually been part of helping the city decide where to put that network of lanes. And JUCA on their own have actually developed a really comprehensive bicycle map of Johannesburg, telling potential commuter cyclists which busy roads to avoid and where the hills are, and important information that you need to know if you're going to risk going out on a bike in a city of this magnitude and this size.
And beyond bikes and cars, what are the choices for anybody in the city in terms of transport?
So private cars, number one. Bicycles way down on the list. People walk, but working class people walk, people with money drive. We have a recently developed system, BRT, bus rapid transit system, called the Ria Via, which goes down to Soweto and through the centre of town and through some pretty well populated areas, and is now being built northwards out towards Alexandra. And that caused a lot of contention among car drivers because it made already busy car routes very busy. But what I hear from people who use it is that it's efficient and it's effective and it's manageable. It has a smart card system, so it is very much an attempt to be as modern as possible. So that's one option. We also have the Gau train, which is this very, very rapid underground train that goes from the airport to centres like Rosebank and Sandton, and now into Park Station in the centre of town. That is used, I think, mainly by relatively more middle-class commuters. It's not cheap,
yes,
but it is fast, and it has changed the city in quite significant ways. We have a train system, which is cheap and old and not that reliable, and also used very much by working-class people, but is very effective in the areas that it covers, but there are many areas that it doesn't cover. It sort of goes from, as far as I know, it goes largely from the south into the city and doesn't really extend very far northwards. But then the most significant form of transport in the city is taxis. These large minibus taxis that traverse the entire whole of inner and outer Johannesburg in complicated networks of routes that are constantly being negotiated and renegotiated, and these are either privately owned. There's quite a lot of
friction between the owners, isn't there?
There's a lot of friction between the owners. There tend to be little outbreaks of conflict between people who own taxis or between taxi firms. There are often accidents that happen because the vehicles themselves are substandard, and they pack them full of people, so there will be way too many people in a vehicle. Some people find them too expensive. They can be extremely slow or hard to maneuver. If you want to get from Soweto to Norwood, there's no way to do that except to stop in the centre of town, and a journey that would take 20 minutes to drive can take 2 hours on a taxi. All of which said, the taxi system developed because there was no public transport in Johannesburg, because under the Group Areas Act, black people weren't even supposed to live here. It's a completely organic system. It's a system that was created in a vacuum of public planning, for poorer people who didn't live in the centre of the city, and it's what we have to work with now.